I want you to think about your home for a moment and consider the space around it. The garden, the boundary fence, the path at the side, the few extra feet of land that, in a crowded country like this one, means everything. Your space, your ground, your legal right. Now I want you to imagine watching very slowly over 4 years someone take it. Not dramatically, not in one sudden moment that you could point to and say, there, that is where it happened. But gradually, inch by inch. A fence moved 6 inches to the left. A new path laid just slightly further into your side. A plant removed here, a post repositioned there. So slowly, so carefully, so precisely calibrated, that by the time most people would notice it was already done. The woman in today's story noticed from the very beginning. She saw every inch, documented every movement, photographed every change, and said absolutely nothing for 4 years. Because in her kitchen drawer, in a folder she had kept since the day she bought her house, was a document, an official document from Land Registry that showed in precise legal terms exactly where her boundary was and exactly how much her neighbor had taken. She kept it in that drawer while he built and extended and repositioned and smiled at her over the fence that was no longer quite in the right place. She kept it in that drawer until the morning his brand new extension, the one that had taken 8 months to build, was finally complete. And then she made one phone call. Welcome back to Quietly Destroyed. This story comes from one of the most engaged Reddit threads I have ever seen on the subject of neighbor disputes. And it is, without question, the most patient, most legally precise, most completely satisfying neighborhood revenge story ever posted. Stay with me, every single minute of this is worth it. Her name on Reddit is 11 years and counting. I'll call her Margaret, not the Margaret from episode 7. A different Margaret entirely. This Margaret had lived in her house, a 3-bedroom semi-detached, in a quiet village in West Yorkshire for 11 years. She had bought it at 41 on her own, after a divorce that had taken almost everything. It was not a large house, it was not a grand house, but it was hers, every brick, every tile, every inch of garden hers. She knew her property the way people know things when they have fought to get them. She knew the exact measurements of every room. She knew the precise boundaries of her land, because she had paid a surveyor, the week she moved in, to walk every inch of her garden boundary with her. And she had kept the survey report and the official Land Registry title plan in a green folder in her kitchen drawer for 11 years just in case. For the first 7 of those 11 years, her neighbor had been a quiet, elderly woman named Patricia, who grew roses and waved from the window, and occasionally left vegetables from her allotment on Margaret's doorstep. 7 good years. And then Patricia moved into a care home, and her son, who had inherited the house, sold it to a man named Gary. Gary moved in on a wet Saturday in October. He was 45, recently separated, newly flush with the proceeds of a house sale, and extremely enthusiastic about home improvement. Margaret introduced herself over the fence that first week. Gary was friendly, chatty, the kind of man who filled a room with his plans for the future. He told her he was going to completely transform the property, new kitchen, new bathroom, rear extension, the works. Margaret smiled, said, "How exciting!" and went inside. To think about it, to let it sink in. 3 weeks later she noticed the garden fence had moved, slowly, quietly, but it had moved, and she wondered what was happening, what was changing. Not by much. 6 inches. Maybe 8. The fence that had stood in the same position for 11 years was suddenly 6 to 8 inches further into Margaret's garden. She went inside, got the green folder from the kitchen drawer, compared the title plan, with what she could see. The fence, without any question, was not where it was supposed to be. She did not go and knock on Gary's door. She did not call the council. She did not post on Facebook. She went back inside, got her camera, photographed the fence, photographed the title plan, wrote the date on a piece of paper, photographed that too, and put everything back in the green folder. Gary did not mention the fence. Margaret did not mention the fence. They continued to wave at each other from their respective gardens. 3 months later, Gary had a new path laid down the side of his house. It was a lovely path, neat, well done, proper block paving, and it was approximately 14 inches further into Margaret's land than it had any right to be. Margaret photographed it, dated it, filed it, said nothing. 6 months after that, Gary removed an old rose bush from the garden boundary. The rose bush that Patricia had planted 17 years ago, that sat, technically, on Margaret's side of the boundary. He replaced it with a concrete post in the wrong position. Margaret photographed it, dated it, filed it, said nothing. By month 18 of Gary's residence, Margaret calculated, using her title plan and a measuring tape she had quietly used on 4 separate occasions, that Gary had incrementally repositioned the effective boundary between their properties by an average of 14 inches across the full width of both their gardens, which, across the full length of the boundary, represented approximately 18 square meters of Margaret's land, taken inch by inch over 18 months, and she waited in silence for the right moment to act. Margaret updated her green folder and added a note to the front page, a running calculation of the total encroachment updated monthly, and said nothing because Margaret, quiet, patient, 11 years in her house, Margaret was waiting for something specific. In month 24, Gary applied for planning permission, a rear extension, single story, 5 meters deep, the full width of the house. Margaret received the neighbor consultation letter, standard procedure, and read it carefully. The extension, as described in the planning application, was to be built right to the boundary of Gary's property. The boundary, as Gary described it in his planning application, was the fence line as it currently stood, which, as Margaret knew, was not where the boundary actually was. Margaret sat with that planning application for a very long time. And then she did something that surprised even herself. She submitted no objection, not because she agreed, not because she was giving up, but because Margaret had spent 2 years watching Gary work, and she understood something fundamental about what was happening. Gary was not a criminal mastermind. Gary was an opportunist, someone who pushed boundaries literally to see what he could get, who had been getting away with it because nobody had said anything. And Margaret had decided to let him get away with it for 1 more year until the extension was done, built on land that was not quite his, paid for, completed, signed off. And then she was going to make 1 phone call. She filed no objection. The planning permission was granted. Building work began 8 months later. Margaret watched from her kitchen window every day as the foundations went in, as the walls went up, as the roof was laid, as the windows were fitted, as the whole structure, built partly on her land, took shape. She photographed it every week from the same spot. In her kitchen, the atmosphere was calm and the surroundings were familiar. 114 photographs taken over 8 months were carefully organized. All dated, all filed, They were stored in the green folder that had been in her kitchen drawer for 11 years. On the day the building inspector signed off the completion, Margaret saw Gary standing in his new extension, looking out through the new window at her garden. He waved and Margaret waved back, then went inside and opened her phone and called a property solicitor. The solicitor, a woman who specialized in boundary disputes and property encroachment, asked Margaret to send over her documents before the consultation. Margaret sent the Land Registry title plan, the original survey report, 4 years of dated photographs, the planning application documents, the 114 construction photographs, and the running calculation from the front page of the green folder, which showed 18.3 square meters of encroachment. The solicitor called back the following morning and said, "Mrs. Margaret, I have been doing this for 19 years, and I want to tell you, this is the most comprehensively documented boundary encroachment case I have ever seen." She explained the legal position. Under UK property law, a neighbor who builds on land that is not theirs is in a state of unlawful occupation of that land. The rightful owner has several remedies available, including a formal claim for reinstatement, which could require Gary to demolish any structure built on Margaret's land, or a financial settlement, compensating Margaret for the permanent loss of her land, which, given that part of a completed extension now sat on it, could be considerable or a combination of both. Margaret listened to all of this and then asked one question. If he has to demolish part of the extension, how much of it would need to come down? The solicitor consulted the documents and said, based on the encroachment measurements and the position of the extension foundations, approximately 1/3 of the extension. Margaret said, "I see, and what would you recommend?" The solicitor said, "I would recommend we send a letter before action, immediately setting out the full legal position, the documented evidence, and your requirements." Margaret said, "Please proceed." The letter, 7 pages long, arrived at Gary's house on a Tuesday morning. Margaret knew this because she was in her garden when the postman delivered it. She watched Gary collect the post, watched him stand in his doorway and open the envelope, watched him read the first page, and then for the first time in 4 years watched him look up and see her, really see her. Gary walked to the garden fence, the fence that was 14 inches too far into her garden, and said, "Margaret, what is this?" Margaret said, "It's a letter from my solicitor, Gary. I think it's fairly self-explanatory." Gary said, "This is saying I have to knock down part of my extension." Margaret said, "Or reach a financial settlement. Yes, those are the options." Gary said, "We're neighbors, we've always got on. Why didn't you just talk to me?" Margaret looked at him and said, very quietly, very calmly, very clearly, "I've been watching you move my boundary for 4 years, Gary, the fence, the path, the rose bush, and now the extension. I have 4 years of dated photographs, a land registry title plan, an original survey report, and a solicitor who called it the most comprehensively documented case she has seen in 19 years. I didn't talk to you because talking to you would have given you the opportunity to stop before you finished, and I needed you to finish." Gary stared at her for a long time, and then he went inside. Gary's solicitor responded within 2 weeks. He did not want to demolish the extension. Margaret's solicitor had anticipated this. A financial settlement was negotiated. Margaret received compensation for the permanent encroachment of her land at a rate calculated by an independent surveyor, based on the current market value of property per square meter in her area, plus compensation for 4 years of unlawful encroachment, including the fence, the path, and the rose bush, plus the full cost of her legal fees, plus the cost of reinstating the garden boundary to its correct legal position, which Gary was required to fund completely. The total settlement was £41,600. Margaret received it 3 months later. She used part of it to have her garden professionally landscaped. She planted a new rose bush in the correct position on her land, and she had a new fence erected with steel posts and concrete gravel boards in the exact position shown on the Land Registry title plan that Gary could not move without a structural engineer and a court order. She wrote at the end of her Reddit post, "People have asked me why I waited until the extension was complete, why I didn't stop him sooner. The honest answer is if I had said something earlier, he would have stopped, apologized, moved the fence back, applied for the extension within the correct boundary, and nothing would have happened to make any of it worth 4 years of watching. But by waiting, by letting him commit fully, by letting him spend his money, his time, his months of building work on something he didn't have the right to build, the cost of what he'd done became real, financial, significant, permanent. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone finish what they started." And then at the very end she wrote 4 words, "The rose bush is back." Gary thought for 4 years that Margaret hadn't noticed or hadn't cared, or was simply the kind of neighbor who avoided conflict. He was wrong on every count. She noticed everything, she cared about every inch. And she was emphatically not avoiding conflict, she was timing it. There is a version of this story where Margaret knocks on Gary's door. The first time the fence moves. They have an argument, Gary moves it back, promises it won't happen again. And then slowly 6 months later it starts again. And Margaret has nothing, no documentation, no pattern, no evidence of systematic encroachment, just one argument over a fence. But this version, the version where Margaret goes inside, gets her camera, and starts the green folder, this version ends with £41,600 and a rose bush in exactly the right place. I want to say something to every homeowner listening right now. Do you know where your boundary is? Not approximately, not I think it's around where the fence is. Do you know legally exactly where your land ends? Go to the Land Registry website right now. You can access your title plan online for £3, print it, put it in a folder, and know your land, because the day someone starts moving an inch at a time, you want to already be holding the proof. That is the end of episode 13. Here on Quietly Destroyed. This one is for every homeowner who has ever watched a neighbor push and said nothing while quietly building their case. Leave a comment below. Do you have a Gary next door? Or have you ever had a boundary dispute of your own? This comment section is going to be the most interesting we have ever had. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week we have a story about a woman whose entire team was made redundant except for the colleague who had been taking credit for everyone's work for years. She got the job, they got the letters, but what happened next 3 months later was something none of them saw coming. I'll see you then. Document everything, know your land, and remember, the best revenge is always served cold. And